our speaker today is Erika Gavenus, and she is an interdisciplinary researcher with a deep love for fish, fishing, and the people who fish. She works with coastal communities to better understand the challenges facing their food systems, the opportunities for the renewal, and the potential implications of both for well-being. Erika's doctoral research was motivated by concerns voiced by First Nations along the coast of British Columbia, that they are not able to access the fish they need to care for their communities, and also by their ongoing efforts to reassert Indigenous fisheries governance in response. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Erika.
Thank you. I'm going to try to share my screen. Is that everyone's able to see that?
Looks good.
Great. Thank you. And thanks for that introduction. And thank you all for joining and for the opportunity to share this work concerning the ways that fisheries governance, as it is enacted by the Canadian state in this case, can affect the ability for Indigenous peoples who are living along the coast of British Columbia to access the food they need to care for their communities or their food security, and to care for the fish and their ancestral lands and waters. And I am coming to this work as an interdisciplinary researcher, more on the social science side than maybe is often part of these seminars. So please let me know if there's any terms or any things I throw out there that you would like more clarity on. As Deb mentioned in the introduction, this work was prompted by conversations I had with community members, primarily members of the Newhalk First Nation, during which I heard deep concerns about how hard it is for First Nations to access food to care for their communities, especially fish. And this concern was echoed in academic writing of Indigenous scholars and their collaborators within the fields of food studies, fishery sciences, and Indigenous studies. And before I get into how a One Health lens, sorry, let me go back one. Before I get into how a One Health lens can help better understand those questions, I want to start by introducing myself a little bit and acknowledging the lands and waters I have learned from, along with the people who take care of them. I do come to this work as a researcher of European descent. I was a settler to the United States, and I was a visitor in Canada. And I have academic training in public health, and a deep love for fish, fishing, and the people who fish. This love was nourished by the lands and waters of the Dena'ina and Sugpiaq of South Central Alaska. And I just had the chance to visit with my daughter and husband, and she got to go on her first boat ride in the family skiff, which was a big milestone for us. It was also her first boat nap, so 2 milestones checked off. I pursued the research I will be sharing today while living and learning on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Hukaminam-speaking Musqueam people, which is where the University of British Columbia's campus sits, and had the incredible privilege to spend time in Newhalk territory along the central coast of British Columbia, learning from that place and its peoples. And I'll highlight throughout, but the guidance shared by Newhalk colleagues and community members runs through all the work I'll be presenting today. And finally, I'm joining you in Knoxville from the homelands of the Cherokee Nation, and I'm grateful for the nourishment this new place provides me, my family, and my thinking. And by way of a little more geographic context, because I know Tennessee is far from the central coast of British Columbia, even though the weather feels familiar today, the studies I'm sharing actually each take a different geographic scope. They're all informed again by concerns raised from the Central Coast. I'll be moving from Canada-wide through coastal British Columbia and then to Newhalk territory on the Central Coast. And here are a few more photos and a more topographic map just to give you a sense of what Newhalk territory looks like. It's generally the lands and waters within this yellow circle. And just for reference, Vancouver is down here, which is about a 12-hour drive away, so it's fairly remote. Turning back to the concern around accessing enough fish, this is a serious problem that tightly entwines the health of humans, animals, and both including fish, but also the animals that eat fish and that they eat, and the environment. And it is at its core a challenge of and to One Health. A first step in approaching this challenge from a One Health perspective is to use a food systems approach. Food systems describe the peoples, practices, and products through which plants and animals and other living beings become food. So we can see that center labeled One Health as including food systems. And more specifically, I approach this challenge grounded in understanding food systems as webs of relationships. These relationships, for example, between people and salmon, require constant renewal, which is done through each party, the people and the salmon, meeting their responsibilities to the other. For example, the story of Salmon Boy, which is shared by many Indigenous peoples along the Pacific coast, teaches that people have a responsibility of returning the unused parts of salmon to the water with care and respect, and that salmon will, in turn, uphold their responsibility, returning year after year to their spawning grounds. Relational ways of looking at the world extend well beyond food systems, and I'm happy to share additional scholars and authors whose work influenced my thinking on this. Mainly, the focus becomes not on the components, not on the health of humans and the health of salmon, but on the health of the relationships between them. How strong are those relationships and chances to renew those relationships? My research, on one hand, examines conditions that are interrupting those relationships and the efforts that promote their renewal. And on the other, I consider what these interruptions and renewals mean for well-being. I've been lucky enough to pursue this work primarily in the context of fisheries. I grew up in a fishing community and a fishing family, and it's very important to me. It started with my master's work, which took place in Western Kenya with Suba and Luo peoples of Mufangano Island, and considered the association between fishing activity on Lake Victoria and food security at the household level, with links to child nutrition, growth, and cognitive development. That work left me both frustrated and inspired, which I think any good master's project should. I was frustrated with the focus on physical health that was so dominant in the field of public health, and also inspired to think about the benefits and challenges fishing can bring a family more broadly. I joined the State of Alaska Salmon and People Working Group on Well-Being, which gave me the chance to think more broadly about those benefits, to consider the many dimensions of well-being and how they relate to fish and fishing. Which brings us back to this quote, again, from Mike Reed and colleagues. With greater understanding of the heaviness of the reports coming from Indigenous peoples that they do not have access to fish to care for their communities. Much more than physical health benefits are being threatened by these interruptions, and much more than physical health benefits are being pursued when First Nations push for greater access and reassert authority over the waters they care for. And while I had previously had the chance to study what not having enough means for communities, during my PhD, I was interested in better understanding the factors that contribute to them not having enough fish, especially considering that Indigenous peoples have long-standing relationships with these fish and distinct rights that flow from those relationships. During my PhD, I therefore focused more so on the interruptions to those relationships and the opportunities for the relationships to be renewed through food systems. And that's the work I'll be covering today, though I'm happy to share and discuss the other studies as well during the Q&A. And of course, there are a lot of factors challenging fisheries access. Some are more environmental, some are more social. There's destruction of spawning habitat, overfishing, interruption of stewardship practices, rising ocean temperatures, harmful algal blooms, just to name a few. And there's a lot of potential for them to interact and have cumulative effects on access for Indigenous peoples. In particular, there's been a considerable amount of attention to the ways that warming marine waters projected with climate change are likely to cause declines in some fish that are really important to First Nations along the coast of British Columbia. At the beginning of my PhD, I joined a research project, the Climate Change Adaptation and Food Sovereignty for Nations, that was working with 4 coastal nations, Haida, Namgi, Tla'amin, and Nujulk, to bring these projections together with dietary surveys and interviews with knowledge holders to inform adaptation plans. I worked most closely with the Nujulk First Nation, and I received clear direction early on that though they were concerned about climate change and interested in adaptation strategies, they did not want to lose sight of the ways Canadian states' actions contribute to the challenges. They were concerned that first, attention to change might detract from holding the state accountable for the disruptions that they have caused. Second, that the fisheries decisions the state were making were actually compounding the declines that we're seeing under climate change. And 3, that declines that were projected are going to only intensify the serious implications these decisions have for their food security. I found similar concerns with the state's actions in the literature I was reading. And in this quote, Darwin Douglas of the Musqueam Nation on the Fraser River, which is right near Vancouver, specifically points to fisheries governance, which started under the colonial government. You might also hear me reference the Crown, that's the colonial government, and has continued under federal regulations. And that these actions interrupted the relationship between Musqueam, salmon, and the river. In an even more direct quote, Arthur Manuel states, Canada is the sick one in the relationship, suffering from what sometimes seems like an incurable case of colonialism. It needs to change profoundly. So again, we're seeing a pointing to needing to study the actions of the state and how it's contributing to some of these challenges. Across 3 empirical studies, I took a closer look at the legal and political aspects of Canadian fisheries governance, including how fish are allocated among users, and I considered how those show up for Indigenous households and communities. I also developed a theoretical argument for evaluating management strategies in ways that bring more attention to their effects on adaptation, potential, and food justice. I'm not going to cover that today, but again, happy to discuss that. I identified food justice as a useful theoretical lens for this work, mostly because of its clear focus on institutional arrangements within food systems. So it specifically looks at those governance structures. Food justice asks how these arrangements influence how food is accessed and distributed, which is akin to food security, and who gets to participate in making decisions, which relates more to food sovereignty. Food justice also highlights the ways that people who hold power can use food systems to solidify those power structures, to limit people's options to resist them. And this last form of food injustice is especially relevant in this context because First Nations fisheries are often tightly entwined with their governance systems, and those governance systems are a source of resisting colonial power. We see that actions that interrupt First Nations fisheries can also disrupt their governance systems. Guided by the concerns of First Nations partners and these theories of food justice, I explored the extent to which fisheries governance as it has been enacted and imposed by the Canadian state can create and perpetuate food injustices, and considered the importance of Indigenous reassertions of governance to realizing more just food systems. This work was informed by and contributes to fields of settler colonial studies, which focuses on settler colonialism as the research focus as opposed to Indigenous peoples. Critical food studies, which contributes theories of food justice and theories of food sovereignty, along with theories of relational food systems, and fisheries social sciences, which brings a lot of focus on fisheries governance. All of these pay attention to the concentration of power within and through systems and support pragmatic mixed methods approach to interrogating these structures from multiple perspectives. And again, I'll be moving across geographic scales from Canada-wide through coastal British Columbia to Nujulk territory. And these reflect the different scales these interruptions are happening, and some of the scales First Nations are working at. They're also working at international, global scale, and even more local. Thinking on the Canada scale, I started with an examination of how the legal and political dimensions of Indigenous access to food fish in Canada. And I started here because people were sharing frustrations that commercial and recreational fishing were taking too many fish, leaving returns too low for First Nations to meet their needs. And these stories are hard to reconcile with the facts that Indigenous peoples in Canada have a constitutional right to fish for food, social, and ceremonial purposes. This is a designation akin to subsistence fishing that is recognized for many Indigenous peoples in the US. And Canadian courts have set out an order in which access to fisheries must be prioritized. First conservation, then Indigenous rights-based fisheries, and then commercial and recreational. And this is often described as the doctrine of priority. I was learning more about the doctrine and the type of challenges First Nations are facing. I thought that the ways Canadian courts have delineated what qualifies as a right to food fish might be contributing to the mismatch we are seeing between the spirit of the doctrine of priority and its implementation. This led me to conduct an analysis of case law documents to assess how courts have characterized these rights. The courts were first asked to interpret what these constitutional rights mean for government actions in the case of R versus Sparrow, which dealt with the regulation of fishing net lengths and the Musqueam's right to fish. So I started my analysis with the Supreme Court's decision, 1990 decision in that case, and worked forward from there. In total, I identified 271 relevant documents for analysis. And I looked at those documents and conducted paragraph by paragraph coding using a coding matrix that I had developed, and then assigned each document a summary rating. I used quantitative and qualitative tools to assess trends and themes across the body of documents. And I'm going to look more closely at the development of the coding matrix here, in which I brought together principles of social justice and Indigenous law. So those are the laws held and practiced by Indigenous peoples to theorize 5 potential characterizations of the right to fish. The first being a right to the activity of fishing. The second is a right to an abundant, healthy population of fish. The third, a right to a fair allocation or share of available fish. And then looking at a right to an amount of fish, so having enough fish or a set volume. And then finally, a right to authority or the right to govern how fishing happens. And then on the other side of the coding matrix, I had a scale from 0 denies to 10 affirms. And that was used to rate how the courts treated these characterizations. And again, I coded these at the paragraph level and then gave each document a summary score. When I plotted the summary scores for each document across the characterizations, I found that activity was the only characterization consistently affirmed. You had characterizations of abundance, allocation, and amount were treated really inconsistently, and there was no clear trend over time. We weren't seeing that the courts were going in one clear direction. And then finally, I did not find any indication that the courts are wavering in their consistent denial of the right to authority. There has been a trend to confine First Nations governance authority to consultation. Many decisions were dealing with the fairness of that process, but not the outcomes. And I can get into more details on this, but I do want to try to stay out of the weeds a bit on the legal side of things. So what does this all mean for First Nations trying to secure fisheries access to care for their communities? So if we think about those 3 middle characterizations of abundance, allocation, and amount as kind of components of a right to available fish, I found that the availability of fish is not legally secure. Instead, it remains on the negotiating table alongside other important aspects of governance. And so First Nations have noted that this can lead them to make concessions they wouldn't otherwise consider. The tendency to recognize the right to the activity of fishing without regard for the fish who make that right meaningful or a dematerialization of the right relies on an understanding that Indigenous cultures are comprised of practices and traditions that can be separated from the materials, lands, resources, beings that surround them. And this aligns well with colonial interests in separating Indigenous peoples from these bases. And it also serves to interrupt those relationships. You're pulling apart those relationships by separating out those rights. And the trend of the Canadian courts to bend towards colonial interests when delineating constitutional rights has been critiqued by scholars. And I've seen that these critiques need to be taken seriously in efforts to promote more just fisheries and food systems. And as a part of this, the political bodies tend to wait for court decisions to determine how to implement the doctrine of priority. And this needs to be re-examined. Instead, such bodies should look towards the ways First Nations are already and always enacting their right to fish as a full embodiment of what is to be respected and affirmed, and thinking of that visual and thinking of respecting the whole component of the right to fish represented there. And the next study, we begin to envision what diets could look like for coastal First Nations with recognition of their full right to fish. And we describe this as restorative diets. Along with conversations with members of the New Hulk stewardship team, this project and paper were guided by staff and other member nations of the Central Coast Indigenous Resource Alliance, which encompasses the Heiltsuk, Kitasoo, Hayes, New Hulk, and Wiikiano nations. This research took place at a time when First Nations are reasserting their governance authority in incredible ways, including reasserting authority over fishing within their territories and taking a leading role in determining efforts to restore fish populations and their habitats and to renew longstanding relationships with fish. With this in mind, we use the term restorative diets to describe diets that will be accessible to First Nations under the interdependent processes of renewing Indigenous governance systems and restoring ecological systems. And we see diets as a component of both that renewal and restoration. We came to work on restorative diets because we were asked to bring together evidence that Central Coast First Nations could use to set and assert their stewardship and restoration goals, and also evidence that First Nations could use to prompt a serious conversation about the fair distribution of available fish, fair in process and in outcome again. In Canada, federal fisheries management usually starts from determining how many fish can be taken from a given population. They try to set that so that enough are left to sustain or rebuild fish populations to a healthy level. I won't pretend that that itself isn't a highly contested process, but we're going to save that for another time because our focus was more so on the distribution of those fish considered harvestable between users. So for First Nations with whom the Crown has no treaty agreement, which are many of the nations along the coast of British Columbia, under federal regulations, fishing for food, social, and ceremonial purposes, again, that's similar to subsistence fishing, requires a communal license. And this is issued to the nation through an Aboriginal fisheries strategy. Part of those licenses sets a ceiling amount on the amount of fish that can be harvested for FSC. And that frees up the remaining harvestable amount to other fisheries. And just really quickly, for people who aren't familiar with salmon, they do return from the fresh saltwater to freshwater to spawn, and that's usually they're harvested in that migration. Because of the setup of the fisheries, usually commercial and recreational fishers will actually encounter the fish first, where First Nations are farther upriver. So that's why kind of this allocation, what is set aside for the other fisheries, that gets harvested oftentimes before First Nations even see the fish. So that's why this level is really impactful. And there were concerns that the evidence being used when making these decisions comes from a narrow time frame that misses some of the most dramatic disruptions to the system. And we were asked to bring together historical evidence that could reflect less disrupted diets and practices. Again, thinking of those as restorative diets. So just one example of what a disruption might be, early management actions taken under Canada's Fisheries Act banned and destroyed Indigenous ways of fishing, including fish weirs, like the one shown here. This also happened in Washington State and up in Alaska under US regulations. These technologies can harvest large amounts of salmon, and historical records show dramatic drops in the amount of salmon First Nations harvested, ate, and traded following the banning of these ways of fishing. If we think about the amount of fish harvested by First Nations through time as this blue curve, knowing that it's very, very small portion of the curve with the continuing deep into the past, we can think about the banning of fish weirs or another similar disruption as this drop off. The concern we are hearing is that the evidence the federal government uses when making decisions about how many fish are needed to meet needs comes from a narrow time frame that misses some of the most dramatic disruptions to these systems, and is that evidence that is being used to set expectations and goals for the fish that are accessible to First Nations. Instead, we were asked to bring together historical evidence that could reflect less disrupted diets and practices that could be used by First Nations to set and insert their governance goals. So this is the restorative diets. And you might recognize this type of diagram if you're familiar with Daniel Pauly's concept of shifting baselines, which describes how reference to disrupted systems can affect the goals and expectations we set for the future. Nancy Turner and colleagues have also described how focusing on the recent past can leave dramatic historical disruptions invisible. And while there has been some work looking at shifts in Indigenous food systems and diets, particularly in the field of exposure assessments, we did not find many examples of that work being considered within fisheries management. Our research goals, therefore, were first, to explore harvest rates consistent with diets of coastal First Nations that are less disrupted by colonial and then federal management or restorative diets. Second, to shed light on the gap between disrupted and restorative diets and to provide methods for examining that gap. And finally, to illustrate the extent to which contemporary assessments of needs may be underestimated with repercussions for First Nations caring for their communities. Returning to the diagram, the first research goal is setting the purple line. The second is looking at the gap between the purple and orange. And the third is thinking about what that means for difference in future expectations. Due to safety concerns around COVID, we were encouraged to pursue this work as much as possible using existing literature and publicly available data. We also know that this remains a very politically charged topic, and many First Nations choose to keep their fisheries data private. We therefore wanted to develop methods using data available to us at a broad geographic scale that First Nations could use internally with their own data. I therefore suggested we use the example of salmon to develop a modeling approach, setting the approximate rate of salmon harvested support restorative diets as a function of caloric demand, the proportion of historical diets coming from salmon, and the amount of salmon harvested to provide 1 calorie. I need to highlight here that because we are using caloric demand as one of the terms, the estimates that we arrive at are very specific to eating salmon. They do not include any of the many other ways salmon support First Nations, such as trade, and should not in any way be thought of as an upper bound for harvest rates. For each variable, I used existing literature to define a distribution of likely values. These curves can be read like histograms where the peaks are the most likely values. And this table lists the literature I used to set these distributions. I know it's very small text, just wanting to highlight the first term serves as the anchor in historical diets, and this was based on evidence from ethnographies, zooarchaeology, and community engagement activities. I randomly pulled a value from each distribution to put in the equation. I did that over and over again and created a distribution of harvest rates, likely harvest rates. And then I used the central 50% to define a range of rates to support restorative diets, as shown down here in the purple. We performed 4 checks on the reasonableness of that range. First, I compared our estimate with conceptually similar rates in the reviewed literature, which we hadn't used to parameterize our model. And this plot shows our estimate at the top with the median and interquartile range. And you can see that our estimate has a wider spread, but the central values are similar to ones and others in the literature. I also checked if the upper level would be a safe amount of salmon for people to eat. I'm coming from a nutrition background, so I was paying attention to the potential for protein toxicity and also upper intake levels for micronutrients like vitamins D. And then I looked at what percent of returning salmon would be harvested if First Nations were to harvest at this rate, and compared that to recommended sustainable rates of harvest or exploitation rates. And finally, and most importantly, we checked in with knowledge holders. So this is a picture of our setup during the New Hawk Stewardship Office open house. And we also checked in with stewardship offices and nation representatives during meetings and presentations. Through all of that, we arrived at a final range of 65 to 235 kilograms of salmon harvested per person per year to support restorative diets. That's about 15 to 73 salmon, depending on the size of the fish. And this is a large range. So we're using these 6 illustrations to show how different dietary practices and caloric demands might be expected to contribute to this wide range of harvest rates, especially since we're looking across many different peoples and ways of life along the coast of British Columbia, where some nations have more access to terrestrial hunting and some have more access to shellfish. So we can see that that's captured in this range. When we went to look at the gap between restorative harvest rates and the rates that are being suggested by current evidence, we found 3 sources that offered evidence at a similar coast-wide scale. Each of these is also a type of evidence that federal decision makers are supposed to be taking into account when they're setting that allocation for food, social, and ceremonial fishing. The first is recently reported catch for FSC. The second is the amount of fish that were recently set aside for FSC. And the final is evidence of how many fish people are eating. And that comes from dietary surveys. Because the restorative diets estimate is specific to salmon eaten, the far right is conceptually the most comparable, because this is really focusing on what is at people's table. When we took the median of the restorative diets, we find a consistent and sizable difference between harvest rates to support restorative diets and the rates suggested by evidence of contemporary salmon use. For a community of 500 people, these gaps are about 13 to 17,000 more fish per year, which we offer as a finding to prompt conversation about the fair distribution of available fish and about the evidence being used to determine that distribution. Looking at the main contributions, through this work, we were able to develop a method to bring multiple lines of evidence together, including evidence of pre-colonial and historical dietary use for First Nations to use in setting and asserting their own governance goals. And there are limitations to this approach, which I'm happy to discuss further. We also found a sizable and consistent gap between harvest rates to support restorative diets and those suggested by contemporary evidence, which highlights how privileging evidence of contemporary use in making decisions about allocation may support continued depression of access for First Nations. Looking forward to next steps, we're collaborating with First Nations and fisheries scientists to project how many fish need to be returning to support restorative diets. What does the abundance need to be for this rate of harvest to be sustainable, and looking at ways to promote those returns with climate change projections in mind. We're also working with individual First Nations to refine the method and the estimated range of harvest rates, and are looking at applying this approach to other species such as halibut, and are working on ways to include other uses such as trade. In the final study I'm going to share, I worked with the New Hawk Health Department and New Hawk Food Office to explore how these interruptions to Indigenous food systems are showing up for households and communities. This was done through analyzing data shared by New Holcomb through the New Holcomb Food Resilience Survey. This study was motivated by the high level of concern and pride about food among New Holcomb. Many of the concerns people expressed related to the ability of the New Holcomb food system to withstand short and long-term disturbances. So the designated reserves are within the valley, Bella Coola Valley, and the last chunk of the road is gravel switchbacks. And so though a lot of food comes in via truck, that isn't always accessible. So during fire season, oftentimes there'll be short-term disturbances to that road, that also looking at longer-term disturbances, including colonialism, but also looking at climate change in that regard. Understanding the New Holcomb food system include the many ways plants and animals become foods for New Holcomb, from purchasing oranges in the grocery store to gathering thimbleberries or trading for herring roe on kelp. The capabilities for households to withstand or rebound from disturbances are likely to show up and be challenged in multiple ways. This pointed us to think about and promote household food resilience across multiple criteria. Based on a review of relevant literature alongside the observations and conversations we were having in community, we identified 7 criteria of household food resilience. In response to the priorities of the New Holcomb Food Office, I analyzed survey responses to characterize household food resilience across these criteria, and then also to assess the extent that they were converging or not within households. The survey was developed in partnership with the New Holcomb Nation Health Department, and participation included New Holcomb living both on and off reserve within the Bella Coola Valley. Survey participation was voluntary. We had 121 participants submit surveys. This represents about a quarter of the eligible households. Initial findings were discussed with New Holcomb leaders, managers, and community members, and during these events, I received feedback on our interpretations and continued to learn about the challenges and opportunities for promoting food resilience. This again is just the picture of New Holcomb territory, where it is located, and some visuals for you to envision kind of this valley. And again, due to the remoteness of their territory, foods grown and harvested within the Central Coast region are especially relevant to the resilience of the New Holcomb food system. And the reserves are located within the valley, close to where the river flows into North Bentinck Arm. Marine foods, beach foods, and fish who return to the river to spawn are all incredibly important foods. Some of these are harvested within the territory, and others are traded for with neighboring nation. Again, this work was conducted while COVID-19 safety precautions continued to be in effect, and this affected how the research took place, and also, importantly, the lives of the people sharing their experiences. There was a lot of restrictions on feasting and community gathering that was affecting how people were sharing and getting together to eat food during this time. This work reiterated what we had been hearing from people, that many New Holcomb households are having a really hard time getting the food they need. This is the case for foods from the grocery store, but even more so for New Holcomb foods that households harvest, trade for, or gifted. In this plot, we have the number of New Holcomb foods out of 17 that households reported needing more of on the y-axis, and the x-axis is it's being grouped by household food security category. So in purple, we have very low food security. This is households that are having a really hard time mostly affording market foods. And then in green, we have higher food security, so not having as hard of a time accessing those foods. So we see households with lower food security tended to have greater unmet need for New Holcomb foods, but even among households with high food security, only a few are saying they have all that they need. We also found that households are facing multiple and diverse challenges when it comes to accessing these foods. This includes financial resources, interruptions to knowledge being shared, and government regulations. And finally, we found convergence across criteria of household food resilience, indicating that there are some households that are likely better set up to withstand and recover from disruptions. The level of concern New Hulk households shared around securing enough food supported the development of the New Hulk Food Office and the work they are doing to center food as a priority for their nation. And the descriptive analyses have been taken up to inform harvest programming that they're rolling out this summer. And the programming is working to be flexible and complement the diverse sets of strengths now households are holding. And looking at what it means for there to be a set of households that are doing all right, I describe these households as pockets of household food resilience. Their survey response suggests there are households in which New Hulk food access, knowledge, practices, and traditional roles are persisting. And the Food Office is aiming to work with these households to support them in contributing to the resilience of the broader system and the resurgence of the New Hulk food system. When I think about these findings within the context of the previous two studies, the high level of unmet need, especially for fish like sockeye salmon and ulican, speaks to the importance of abundant and healthy populations. And though management decisions have been implicated in the declines of both those fish, legal recourse has been limited because the court's interpretation of the doctrine of priority is focusing on activity. Additionally, the use of current rates of use to set management goals would risk setting these lower insufficient levels as acceptable or as goals moving forward. Instead, the New Hulk Nation is working to reassert their authority to govern fishing and other activities within their territories, such as logging, on their terms. And they see these efforts as central to adapting to climate change and the resilience of their system. These findings offer additional insights that can help guide that work, and I'm grateful to have had the chance to contribute to that exciting work happening within the New Hulk Nation. Through these studies, I explored the extent to which fisheries governance along the coast of British Columbia, as it is enacted by the Crown and the Canadian state, contributes to food injustices faced by First Nations. I found injustices relating to who is recognized to hold authority within decision-making processes, to the distribution or allocation of fish for food fisheries, and to the ways in which interrupting the relationships and practices of Indigenous fisheries can challenge the renewal of governance systems. Through household surveys and community-based work, I found that these injustices are showing up in Indigenous communities, as many households have a hard time weathering or recovering from disruptions to their food systems, including longer scale disruptions like climate change. Finally, these studies together present compelling reasons to support the reassertion of Indigenous fisheries governance, and I have tried to do so throughout my work. In recognizing and identifying the tendency for the Canadian government to interrupt relationships between Indigenous peoples, salmon, and their waters as a form of food injustice, I also came to recognize how problematic the expectations for how we study these systems can be. The biases and tendencies to think about humans, animals, and the environment as separate, unrelated entities not only misses really important insights into why challenges are emerging and the potential responses we could be trying, it can also create a feedback between existing power structures, in the case of my work, looking at the settler colonial state as that power structure, and the ways that we are expected to conduct research. So I guess this is my invitation, maybe as a rogue social scientist coming into your lunch seminar series, to invite you all to consider how you can, as researchers interested in One Health, purposely destabilize that feedback between research expectations and existing power structures that were built and maintained by pulling these three circles apart. For my part, I'm hoping to continue to engage with the challenge of conceptualizing and operationalizing well-being in these contexts, especially thinking about what well-being means if we think beyond the individual. And two streams of question I see these being important for. First is questions around how declines in abundance might be challenging collective well-being. For example, if we see the fraying of trading networks or practices of sharing or increased tension between users within a community. And second is how restoration activities might serve as opportunities to renew relationships with each other, with other beings, and with lands and waters, and how that can promote collective well-being. I want to say thanks to the many, many people and organizations who have supported me in this work, and thank you for your attention. I look forward to your questions and the discussion we're able to have, or at least get started today. Thank you.
Thank you, Erica. That was awesome. We have time for questions if anybody has any that they would like to ask right now. And you can you can stop the screen share if you want.
Yes.
I would love to start with a question if nobody else wants to start. When you are looking at within the community and looking at the variation in food security, did you identify specific reasons for that disparity, and some being having high levels of insecurity and others not, or having low, and also you mentioned that you looked across different food types. Was there, and you thought it was mainly like the market foods, but was there anything specific identified within those as well?
Yeah, thanks for that question. A few different ways to respond. First, I would say the level of food insecurity that was seen within the community is higher than you would see in general population in Canada as well. So just noting that it is, people are having a really hard time across the board within the community. And there is disparity. We're seeing that there are some households that are falling into the higher food security category. The way food security is categorized and measured in a lot of survey instruments, and in this survey as well, is pretty focused on the affordability of market foods. And so that measure we were really using to reflect that ability to access market foods. And so that generally tracks pretty well with the other reasons why there's income disparity between households. We looked at additional criteria, knowing that because of the different types of foods and food systems that people are navigating and the different challenges people are facing, we looked at other questions as well. And in that we saw that it was a pretty mixed bag. Some households had the finances but didn't have the time. Some, especially when looking at harvesting new Hulk foods, some had the knowledge but didn't have the transportation. And so that's one of the reasons why the food office is working really hard to make more of a menu of programming and instead of a one size fits all, and is also working. One of the things that came up is that there are some households that and they are showing up as being food secure as well, where they still are have held on to that knowledge and the practices. And so really seeing those as households that can be a source of spreading that knowledge back into the community. And then I feel like you had another part to your question. Oh, if there were certain foods. So the again, that food security question questionnaire generally focuses on market foods, just because of the way the questions are phrased. We looked at asked about 17 New Hulk foods, and on that list, mm, sockeye salmon and ulican. So ulican's another small fish that, well, salmon aren't small, but a small fish that moves from saltwater back to freshwater. And those were top on the list. Those were previously really abundant in the Bella Coola River, and really important as trade items. And both of those have had pretty notable declines. They just had an ulican run again this last year for the first time in many, many years, which was very exciting. But yeah, so those species where the abundance has crashed is really the top ones that people were noting. And they're working quite hard to bring those back.
Awesome, thank you. There's a couple of questions in the chat.
Yes. So I am only just finishing up as a PhD. I don't work with any students directly. I had, I guess I work with First Nations students within my research group under my same advisor, and worked directly with First Nation colleagues in community who weren't students but are researchers. And so that is in addition to elders. No, that's okay. I don't mind being mistaken for being more senior than I am. And then around eating purple sea urchins to increase food security. First, my first thought is yum. I enjoy eating purple sea urchin. And there's different, there's different thoughts. So one of the, I'm trying to think. Yeah, one of the nations that was in the larger project that I was working on was Skidegate within the Haida Nation. And they are focusing a lot, they're seeing that tuna are coming into their waters more. And so as a climate adaptation is looking at how can tuna be incorporated into food security and promoting food security. And one of the interesting pieces that came up within interviews with knowledge holders in that project was discussing that that it's not necessarily a new species, that the tuna have been seen in the waters before, and thinking of it as ways to kind of reintroduce yourself to old friends kind of came up. And so thinking about if there are foods that that maybe haven't been eaten as frequently right in the now or in the recent past, but there might be some traditions of those being in the water before. The other thing the Haida are doing are they're actually connecting with other Indigenous people across the Pacific Islands to talk to them about how do you fish for tuna. And so that kind of networking is also happening of sharing traditions across Indigenous communities, as some of the food species that are most important are possibly having a harder time turning to others. Sea urchins, you also get into the stickiness around sea otters and kelp, and so there's a lot there that I don't want to wade into too much because that's not where my research is, and there's a lot of different strong opinions on that.
I know we're out of time, but I have one last question. I was just curious that in your discussions with First Nations, if there is like a prevailing thought about why there are these major decreases, like is it mostly the overharvesting, is it mostly climate change, or is the idea in First Nations that it is a combination of all these things? And then my second part of the question is just if anybody that you talk to in these communities had ideas about how to increase spawning returns and that kind of thing, like other than outside of policy, I guess.
Yeah. So there's yeah, I would say mostly it's varies and is a combination. And so it's gonna, I mean, for certain certain species, I'm most familiar with salmon, but salmon is such a tricky, it moves through so many different spaces. And so there's concerns throughout the watershed that relate to that. There's predation, there's overfishing, kind of all of that comes in. I will say that in addition to kind of the typical list that comes to mind was really just that focus on how their opportunities to meet the responsibilities to the fish are being denied. And so they aren't being given the chance to govern and to steward the fish because of the way the state is doing that. And for many, that means that the fish don't need to return and won't return. And so interruptions to that were pointed out, and that includes a lot of stewardship practices that have been identified as being really helpful in supporting healthy populations of fish. So, for example, like the weir, the picture of the weir that I showed, it not only captures really efficiently, can catch a lot of fish, it also doesn't kill them when it catches them. And so there's selective harvesting that's done. So different size fish can be released upstream. There's also evidence that it wasn't that more females were released upstream. And so when you're looking at hatchery releases, it's generally 1-to-1 male female release. And so things like that, bringing back some of those practices that were really central to the harvesting, but also to the governance and the rules and protocols that were in place, would go a long way. And for salmon, again, you have commercial fishing often is happening in the open water, and so you're harvesting what's called like mixed stocks. So you're harvesting salmon before they've separated into their specific streams. And so if you have one stream that's having a really hard time for whatever reason, and another population that's doing okay, you can't really sort that out in the marine waters. But if you have more terminal fisheries, the people who are harvesting on the stream that's having a hard time could scale back. And so also just like where the harvesting is happening and things like that were also pointed out. So yeah, there's a lot. But it's also, I think, yeah, thinking about just the lengths that it could go to have the governance returned, and just also thinking about like adaptive management, that being able to manage these fisheries at a hyper local instead of kind of in this case from Ottawa would be a huge step.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks for sharing all that. And just to highlight what you said, yeah, it makes even more sense. I'm thinking about even fishing regulations in the United States, and it's like we don't really have different regulations on female populations and male populations, or even in Florida, maybe the Gulf versus the Atlantic side have different regulations, but they're so there's so many variability, there's so much variability in even those local regions. So that makes a lot of sense.
Well, thank you again. And we are out of time. Thanks for everybody who joined us. And remember, next month we'll have another awesome talk. And then they put the Halloween event on your calendar and the student leadership summit that would be great for, any participants, or if you have students that would be interested. So Erika, thank you. Thank you so much. That was really awesome.
No, thank you for having me. It was wonderful to get to share with all of you.